you. Good evening, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome to this fourth installment of the EUI Conversation series. For those of you who are here for the first time or who are joining online, or those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicolas Guillot. I'm professor of history here at the EUI. And today I have the great pleasure and the privilege to welcome a guest who very much embodies the spirit of this event series, somebody who believes in the importance of ideas, somebody who values conversations. And it's also a daunting task because Dominique de Villepin needs no introduction, yet he deserves one. I'm sure that even for those of you who are not versed into French politics, the name is familiar, if only because of the historic speech he gave in 2003 at the UN Security Council, in which he stated and defended his country's principal refusal to join the coalition that was about to intervene militarily in Iraq. But this was only the most visible moment in an otherwise remarkable diplomatic career, which led him to occupy a number of important positions. I will mention just a few. He was first secretary of the French embassy in Washington, D.C. He was diplomatic advisor in New Delhi. He headed the Bureau of African Affairs within the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was chief of staff of the minister between 1993 and 1995. And under the presidency of Jacques Chirac, he became Secretary General of the presidency. After that, successively Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2002 and 2004, Interior Minister, and finally from 2005 to 2007, Prime Minister of France. He is known as an advocate for multilateralism and diplomacy. And even though he's taken a step back from active politics in the past year or so, he's been a frequent presence on talk shows, news programs, and social networks, offering a refreshingly honest and robust commentary on current affairs. And so it's only fitting to host him here in Florence, a city that has given us a long line of diplomats, from Machiavelli, who was an ambassador, to Giorgio La Pira, who in the 60s and 70s turned this city into a hub for principled diplomacy focused on peace and human rights across ideological divides. But there's another reason why Dominique de Villepin belongs to that lineage, is that Machiavelli and La Pira were not just diplomats, but prolific writers. And this is another facet of his persona, one I must confess I was not completely aware of. And so when he very kindly accepted our invitation, my first reaction was relief, because I thought to myself, after a public intellectual, a scholar, and a novelist last time with Dacia Marini, finally I won't have too many books to read to prepare this event. Boy, was I wrong. His bibliography goes over 20 volumes, something that would put a lot of us here to shame. And of course, you will find in it essays on French politics, essays on international politics, but what's really striking about it is that he seems to be navigating effortlessly a bewildering variety of genres. You'll find novels, collections of poetry, art criticism, and I would also be remiss here in Italy not to mention that he was last year's recipient of the Premio Nonino, one of the most prestigious Italian literary prizes. So I should also mention, as a historian, I should do that on top of all of this, he has also written 3 volumes of a historical study on Napoleon based on primary material, each of which clocks in at over 400 pages.
800.
One is 800. Yeah, I haven't read that one. So it's in the spirit of welcoming actually perhaps a peer, somebody who truly belongs to a European university in Florence, that I want to ask you to join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dominique de Villepin. And tonight, the focus of our conversation would be his latest book, Le Pouvoir de dire non, Power to Say No. The library has told me that they purchased a few copies, so you're welcome to go and check it out. And perhaps the first thing I want to do is to start with the mood of the book. There's a sense of urgency. It's born out of a sense of urgency. There's a sense that the world we were taking for granted, the international order, is something we thought was resilient, turns out to be very brittle and is collapsing. There's also a sense of acceleration, that we have a hard time making sense of what's going on because of the speed at which things are happening. Everything, you write, I'm quoting you, seems to go awry, to turn into dust and elude our grasp, end of quote. Things that we deemed were unthinkable even a few months ago seem to be happening on a daily basis and becoming the new normal. And I would like to start with one of these events and perhaps ask you a personal question. A month to a day today, we woke up and read in the newspapers about Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who was, I suppose the right word is abducted, kidnapped by the US military and exfiltrated to New York. And that's one of these events that was truly shattering and unthinkable only a few weeks before. And I would like to ask you, before maybe moving into the significance of this event, as someone who grew up in Venezuela, who speaks Spanish, how did you feel that day? Someone for whom Venezuela is not just a spot on the map, but part of a life.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Nicholas, and thank you for being all here. It's a pleasure to be in Florence, because I don't know why, but traveling around the world, you always feel a little bit safer here in Florence. It's like being connected with the right history, the right people, and memory. Of course, what happened in Venezuela was not a complete surprise for me. But the surprise was, how can a big country like the United States of America forget the one very single thing everybody that goes to Venezuela would find out in a couple of minutes, is that there is no more nationalistic, no more country which is made about the criticism of the US, the anti-Yankee sentiment, And to imagine the Trump administration going into Caracas and abducting not the elected president, but the one who was running the country just like that, without taking into account the realities of the country, the expectation of the people waiting for a change in the overall complete political situation, and acting like if it was the backyard of the US. The US have been doing that for many, many years, but we thought that that was part of another world. It was part of another times. And forgetting about this mentality of the Venezuelan people, the mentality which is very much shared all over Latin America, was a sign that we were entering in a new era where the US were not caring anymore at all about what the people of the world, countries around the world, were thinking about the US. For me, it was a huge sign of the end of traditional soft power of the US. The US had been putting so much energy during more than a century to build up this American way of life, to build up this vision of themselves, seeing as the country of Marlon Brando, Superman, and Coca-Cola. And there we were back to an era which is not even something that people had in mind, which is neocolonialism, recolonization of Latin America. So the image is a real killer for the US. And if you think about how much in the last years China has been putting energy all around the world through the new Silk Roads, the One Belt, One Road, to adjust, to adapt to the needs of most of third world countries, most of the emerging countries. Of course, doing a lot of mistakes, but taking the lessons from the mistakes. Seeing the leader of the Western world acting in such a rude way was a sign for me of de-civilization, a way to forget about everything that should be learned in universities, in academies, in the foreign department. A complete amnesia of the US, behaving like if they were children in a grocery store. I like this, I take it. I like that, I take it. Not thinking at all about the consequences, which is a huge consequences all over the world.
But it's not even a very serious taking it, right? Because the oil in Venezuela, these are the first reserves in the world, but it's an oil that's hard to extract, it's very viscous, it's expensive to refine. The majors said, no, we're not interested. So isn't it more of a demonstration to the rest of the continent?
Well, that's a big question mark, because as you say, it's not a realistic approach of Venezuela. Politically, it doesn't have the consequences that any Democrat would expect, because they keep on working with the vice president, now president, acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. The whole establishment of Venezuela has not changed. Even political prisoners, today they are still in the jails of Caracas, even if the promise exists to get rid of most of them. So that's the political part. Economically, as you mentioned, there is no reality in trying to get these resources on a short-term basis. First, because most of the US companies that had to leave Venezuela several times in the past, they have no willingness and no capability from one day to another to go back and take these resources, because, as you mentioned, the oil of Venezuela is a very specific oil, very heavy oil, and to put back all these installations back in place will take years. So it's a 10, 15 years approach. Will be needing 10,000 billions of dollars. So it has no reality. But that's where it's fascinating, because the US policy seems to keep on changing objectives without really knowing exactly why they do these things. You can follow the fantasy. For example, in Greenland, you can understand that when you have a country of a little less than 10,000 million square kilometers, you'd be willing to double the size of the country, having Canada and having Greenland, and to have a bigger size of a country than Russia. But what for? What is the big design? What is the big objective? And that's where there is something which is very difficult for anybody using a rational approach of international relations to understand exactly what is the goal, what is the key objective. I think if we do not integrate the fact that the world has changed in the last decade, and we have come from a world of abundance to a world of scarcity. I think this is the main idea. The world has changed. We are seeing a revolution in terms of power. And in the new world, of course, the big countries need to be empires to be able to take over the resources, to take over what is left as the wealth of the world, and have an advantage in the competition with the other empires. So I believe this is the end line of the US today.
I want to touch upon this question of empires later on, but you mentioned the collapse of US soft power. But there's more than that, right? We're living through a moment in which a global hegemon is reckoning with its own decline, but also cashing in on that previous hegemony to secure its own security at a macro-continental scale and get ready to compete with other empires. One of the narratives that have settled in the commentary and the punditry around this is the crisis of the so-called international liberal order. And what strikes me, and I think your book goes a bit against this, is that in the commentary at large, in the culture at large, in the conversation, there's a lot of nostalgia about this. But isn't it the case that rather than running after what can be kept alive of this international liberal order, isn't it the case that now that its main custodian, the US, is no longer vouching for it, we Europeans realize that now that it no longer works in our interest, we realize something that the global South has known all along, namely that in that international liberal order, international law never really operated as law in a robust sense, that rule-based is already a euphemism for an instrumentality in which you essentially can exercise hegemony through norms and laws, but also navigate exceptions, develop narratives of legal plausibility when it fits your own interest. That's something the Global South has known for a long time. Is there anything to be saved there, or should we just move on from that?
No, I agree with you. Most of the leaders of Western democracies are facing this new reality of the world disorder and the understanding that they maybe missed a point in the last decades and more. The main point has been very clearly appearing in an obvious way for everybody during the Ukrainian war, when most of the European leaders felt the need to lecture the leaders of the emerging country, because they thought that the aggression of Russia was of such a nature. They could not understand how most of these countries were continuing to have almost normal relationship with Vladimir Putin. Talking about South Africa, talking about Brazil, talking about Indonesia. Most of the European, and this was very obvious when you were discussing with someone like Emmanuel Macron. He was enraged by the fact that most of the Africans were not taking seriously this aggression and not changing their attitude, their policy towards Russia. And then came the Gaza crisis. And then everybody saw the huge hypocrisy of the European leaders. But the question is, was it hypocrisy or was it a lack of understanding, a lack of a non-ability to see the world as it is? And that's something that really stunned me. I have a very good friend who had very high position in French diplomacy who wrote a book. The name of the book was Other People Around the World Don't Think Like Us. And this is very strange about Europe. And this is a revolution that needs to be made in every single school of Europe. The world is full of different people. The world is full of different experience. And when you live in Bamako, when you live in Manila, you don't see the world in the same way. And I used to say that one of the most striking experience you can make traveling is opening the TV and go to the local channels. When you go to Abu Dhabi, you open and you listen to Arabiya. When you go to Moscow and you listen to a local English channel, when you go to China and you go and listen, you see the world completely differently because the camera is not looking at the world, not looking at the map of the world, not looking at the history of the world, not looking at the people of the world in the same way. And this reality is coming in a world which is today in your own hand with your iPhone. You can be connected with everywhere. But you don't have the way to use this AI capacity, your iPhone capacity, because it doesn't give you the mindset. So the biggest work for diplomats, the biggest work for thinkers, the biggest work for students is to realize this ability to see the world with the feeling, with the eye of somebody who lives far away. And looking at Gaza, of course, the whole world saw that what was called an aggression in Ukraine was not named in the same way in Gaza. And they saw also, which is obvious, that a dead children in Europe doesn't have the same price that a dead children in Sudan, Ethiopia, or elsewhere. And this is such a blow in the face of the Western world that it puts forward the question, what is the future of such an entity as the Western world? On what Europe should be based to be able to renew with the promise of Europe? You see, the promise of enlightenment was based on the idea that every single person was equal. And when you look at our world institution, it's very true when you look at the rules-based order. It's even true when you look at international law. We should always be looking for, are we sure that equality is here? Are we sure that we are giving the same importance to this rule of law? When you look at the International Penal Court, how long has it taken to have the International Penal Court indicting Western leaders? I was, as you mentioned, fighting in 2003 for a non-intervention, but nobody talked about any responsibility for Tony Blair or for George W. Bush. Tony Blair is even coming back in the Middle East with such a background, coming back in the Middle East in the Peace Council. Amnesia. And this is what is so costly for Europe today. And that is why the opportunity to reinvent Europe, not in the Western world, but as its own lineage, its own tradition, its own mission in the world, as a source of balance, where we can see that today the US and most empires are a source of imbalance and injustice.
You've raised a smorgasbord of points that I want to now go back to and circle back to. You just mentioned Gaza, so I'll just skip to that, if I may, for a minute, before then moving back to Russia, which you also mentioned empires, and then I'd like to pivot to Europe. On the case of Gaza, you mentioned the double standards that everybody could see. There has been a complete dereliction of moral duty when it comes to Gaza and Western leaders. And you've been one of the few who was outspoken about it. Why do you think was there such a case of double standards in Europe about Gaza? Where do you think the fault lies?
I think that there is first a point which is very important to mention, because it relies on the fact that our relationship with history as intellectuals, as citizens, is not a relation which is making us more independent, which may help us to think bigger and wider. On the contrary, history is, for many Europeans, a burden. And we are still coping with this history, whether we talk about World War II or the colonial era. This is a burden. I see every day the difficulty in France to manage to have a new relationship with Algeria, which is difficult because this is waiting on the ability for decision makers to look forward. And the only way out for politics is to base any decision on principles. And the failure of Europe in the last years has been the inability to stand with their own principles. And the reason why the European leadership is so weak in front of Donald Trump, so weak in front of all the world leaders today, is because they rely on the necessity to keep on playing with politics, playing with some electoral calculus, trying to navigate with public opinion, and not understanding that a very straightforward dedication to respect principles is the only way to ground European ability to look to the future strongly. And in the example of Iraq, if we go back to 2003 to make the comparison with the current situation today with Ukraine, Gaza, or Iran, American intervention was justified not only by ally, but mainly by the fact that they were willing to fight against a regime which was not in any way agreeable, and we were all agreeing. But they thought that through force, and we have this mystery in our world, force seems to be having more legitimacy than anything else, more legitimacy than international law, more legitimacy than any other moral standard. Why? Because force carry on the idea that it's more connected to reality. It's more connected to the ability to change the world, to have results. You see, what is killing politics in liberal democracies, and that's why we are so threatened by illiberal movements and populist movements and parties today in Europe, and this is the case in France very strongly, is the fact that we have lost the connection with reality. We have lost the ability through politics to change the life of our citizens. So there is this dream that if we cannot do it peacefully, force will have the legitimacy, the post-capacity to create a new reality. And the narrative is, because you failed doing it by the book and through the rules, then do it with force, which is exactly the vision of the neocons, exactly the vision of Benjamin Netanyahu, which is you must defend civilization, and this justify any means. All means can be used because at the end of the day, it is a matter of civilization. What they forget, and there was at the beginning of the 21st century a debate which was not on the table but was a debate among diplomats. when Hubert Védrine, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in France under François Mitterrand, raised the principle, the idea of hyperpower to analyze the situation of the US in the 90s. When I became Minister of Foreign Affairs, the first concept I raised was the idea of vanity, the powerlessness of power, which was exactly the opposite. Because at the end of the day, the promise through force to re-enchant the Middle East was a lie. The promise through force to change the situation of a country like Iran has most probably all the evidence of a lie. The problem is, what can our democracy do to respond to horror? When you have a situation like in Iran with more than 30,000 people being killed by a regime, you cannot stand and not do anything. At last, the Europeans have decided a couple of days ago to put on the list of terrorist organizations the Revolutionary Guards. But of course, this is not solving the problem. So the question is, when you are facing such difficulties, it seems that force has a way to liberate energy, to liberate at least all this frustration about violence and injustice. How can democracies come up with other responses and not be confronted with the idea of powerlessness? So the problem is still on the table. In the end of the 90s, we have invented the responsibility to protect. And of course, the responsibility to protect is very difficult to put in place. And all the experience we had in the past, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's Bosnia, are of course limited response. So we are still looking for what is the best solution. But there's one thing we know for sure, that force is not the answer. But it is still the mirage, it is still the illusion, which is used by empires as a way to advance their own marks, to advance their own interest, and to use it as a way to conquer more influence in the world.
On this issue of force and the capacity of European democracies to perhaps try to find a different way from performing or actually doing politics for real, you mentioned Russia. There's been, between 2003, which you also mentioned, and today, a complete change in the landscape of what war is. We used to have imperial wars, essentially, with counterinsurgencies, and they were completely asymmetric, and they could be kept on the outskirts of the Western world. Today, that has changed completely. There's a return of land war in Ukraine, genocidal war in Gaza, and there's a sense that when it comes to Ukraine, it's as if this war came as a prop to keep afloat an idea of Europe which I think is delusional. Europe is about peace, international law, and federalism. It's not about war, it's the opposite. But as if it came serendipitously to keep afloat a project of Europe which has exhausted itself. And so we keep going at it. And I was wondering what you think about this, number one. And number two, in your book, you talk about Russia. And of course, Russia is to be condemned for what is clearly a war of aggression. But you also say that that's not enough. There's also to be, and I'm quoting you of memory, my memory here, memory and respect for Russia. These are your words in the book. That would be the first question, what is to be done? And number two, as a subsidiary question, isn't it the case that Europe, by just providing military assistance to Ukraine, France and Italy by actually taking an earmarking on their own stocks, but the rest of Europe pooling money, hundreds of millions, that are used to buy American weaponry. So we have a war which is essentially in the interest of the US and at the detriment of Europe as a political project. And it strikes me that does it make sense, according to you, to have this sort of assistance to Ukraine without at the same time engaging Moscow, if not through Washington? Isn't that the ABC of the security dilemma, whereby we build up deterrence, but we also don't talk and we don't signal anything?
Yeah, I think that you're right. In the case of Ukraine, we are facing a double frustration. The first one on the field, on the military assistance given to Ukraine. We are not handling this in a way to be really effective and to change the history of the conflict. I think at the start of the war, we missed many opportunities. And the Versailles summit at the beginning of 2022, which was seen as an important move forward, was not a push big enough to really address a strong sign to Russia. I think Russia has received the message that most of the Western countries could live with the idea of an open conflict today, and maybe tomorrow a frozen conflict, and would not really be committed to solve the matter. And at the time, the Biden administration has sent also the same mixed message. Not that they were not concerned, but they were not ready to really face Russia and pay the price for it. And the same message of non-true and full engagement in terms of military was given diplomatically. There is also this idea that facing the Russian power, we are still hesitating. And the big question today is Europe able to face Russia alone without the US? Can the US leave the European fighting alone and supporting alone Ukraine and pay the price ideologically in terms of influence around the world without losing all the support of their allies, not only in Europe, but also in Asia and in the Middle East? I think the signal is so strong for the US that they will lose too much. So they are keeping a position which is in between. They are not very much interested by the Ukraine conflict, but at the same time, they don't want to take the blame to leave the place. So we are in this in-between, which is very damaging. And one of the big mistakes, I think, of the European leadership is not to have been able to put on the table of the US administration the obligation to take their responsibility. We are trying to minimize the attitude of the US, while we should have said very bluntly and collectively that they have a choice to make. Are they with us? Are they not with us? And if they're not with us, they have to pay also the price for it as a superpower. And I think that the position on all the different subjects that are on the table, which is tariffs, which is technology, which is digital competition, are relevant of the same inability of the European to make the good choice. And that's why the key question for Europe today is the question of their own sovereignty. And we keep on having the same narrative for Europe, as if we were not facing the key question of our survival. I think today the question of the survival of Europe, of the European Union, of our institution, is the biggest question linked to another question, which is the question of democracy. We have the question of sovereignty, which is the question of our freedom, which is really on the table. And we have the question, for how long, for how many months are we still going to be liberal democracies? And are we going to be aware the day the things will change? Because maybe nobody will tell us that we have switched and changed completely our political system. And this is what's so strange about this world, is things happen and nobody tells us. People are not aware. Nobody talks about it. Social networks have this ability to use algorithms which are always hiding the true reality of what's going on, the true challenges. We are not confronted to this very blunt question. Are we still acting as democracies? Are we still acting as sovereign Europe? To tell you the truth, I think most of the Europeans in Europe today have been, at one moment or another moment in the last months, ashamed of Europe. But how to express this feeling? When you see that the three big images of Europe are ghost images. And I don't want to be personal, but I think it's important to point responsibilities. When Ursula von der Leyen went in Scotland to sign the trade treaty, what was the legitimacy to sign this treaty? What was, in terms of history for our people, the meaning of the European leadership? When Mark Rutte, heading NATO, but being one of the strong and important European figures, calls Donald Trump daddy and gives a lecture to the Europeans saying...
He sure doesn't have the power to say no.
Yeah, of course. But when he lectured the Europeans saying, okay, you can dream that you are able to defend yourself, but don't dream too much. Yeah. Ghost figure. And even the positive figures. And we are in Italy. The third figure for me, which is a very positive figure, of course, because he has achieved many things, but he's a ghost figure because he does not enter into the reality of politics. Mario Draghi. We keep on talking about the Draghi report, but the Draghi report will never happen. And we all know that. So Europe is a ghost. And the very strong, deep reality is today, are we going to be sovereign in terms of trade? Are we going to be sovereign in terms of security? Are we going to be sovereign in terms of financial organization? Are we going to be sovereign in terms of digital? And in 14 months, we're going to have elections in France. The current digital systems, with the US platforms having in their own hand the capacity to play with all of our political systems, when I see that in all the platforms, whether Chinese, TikTok, or Instagram, populist leaders, someone like Jordan Bardella in France, is pushed by the algorithm more than 10 times, 20 times, 100 times more than any other politician. How do you want to win a fair election when you know that polls and social networks are going to be the two main keys for the election? We have seen in Romania the way they could play with that kind of game. So we have not really understood that we are in a new moment of the history of Europe, and the worst can happen. And the worst can happen, and nobody can tell us, is there a way back? How do you come back from populism? How do you come back from Trumpism? Whenever it's installed, you enter in another world of altered reality with no truth, with a narrative which is so powerful that the democratic narrative, which question, answer, debate, cannot even give a hint and compete with the other narrative. So it is a very big anxiety to see this whole system changing without most of the big actors taking responsibility. Parties, medias, all in hands where, of course, this evolution is seen as not a dangerous evolution. So where to look at to find resistance? Where to look at to find the power to say no? Intellectuals, which it's amazing to see how many intellectuals are already in this mindset. Because of course, if you are invited on the TV sets, if you want to publish, publisher houses, where to find independent publishing houses. So the whole system is being kidnapped.
But that would be my question to you then. What is to be done? Because you mentioned platforms and the way they have corrupted politics. If you take any platform, but let's say XX or X-Twitter, what they do essentially is aggregate interests in a flexible way and mobilize them when need be. So they do what political parties are supposed to do, but they do it faster and they do it better. You could argue that, especially for catch-all parties which are no longer operating along ideological cleavages.
And they earn money.
And on top of that, they earn money.
They have a financial
Exactly.
benefit.
So the question becomes, where do you start? How do you disentangle yourself? Because the thing is, so that's the first question, that's for politics in general. But there's a social question to this, right? You talk a little bit about capitalism in the book, but that's a form of capitalism which today is so deeply enmeshed in our everyday lives. Marxists would call about the real subsumption under capital. But if I just produce value by being alive online, by producing data, the question is also, where's the dividend of this? You could make the claim, you could make the argument at least, that to the extent that these infrastructures are so much meshed in our lives in terms of our work, the way we get information, but also our emotions or our relationships, they should be a public infrastructure. But on the contrary, we are in a system of extreme concentration of wealth. And this is a private wealth instead of being what should be a commonwealth. So how do you start by reopening a political space and a political vision for Europe in this landscape, which is rather dismal?
I think that we have to look at the two extremes. The first one, as you mentioned, is how the system is so intricate that it's very difficult to imagine how you can just put it away. Intrication goes with the logic of new empires on foreign policy in the international scene, and domestically it goes with the collaboration between two forces, populist parties, patriot parties, we say in France, illiberal movements, and oligarchies, which have in many ways the same interest. Because we are in a world where the old traditional capitalist system is dying. Because the legitimacy of this system cannot allow this system to stay in place without an authoritarian regime. Because it does not, it is not able to validate the interest of the middle classes and the interest of the poor classes. So it needs to put more force, more authority to be able to take over the benefit that they still want to take over. So this is the double mechanism, domestic and international mechanism. But I think there is, on the other side of the story, something we should look, because this is something new coming back from old ages, which is despair. The feeling that any one of us can imagine of being a young student in Iran, facing the mullahs regime, killing their children, which is what to believe, where the salvation is going to come. This despair, which is exactly the same feeling that you can imagine in Sudan, in Ethiopia, of mothers, young boys in Gaza, this despair of a world so unfair, so dramatically selfish, confronts us with the logic of history. History is not anymore, as we used to have the idea, marching to progress. History is now a story of dealing with catastrophes, again. And that brings back sentiments, feelings, experiences that we thought were finished. And now every one of us can share the feeling of other people around the world being in such a position. And you have leaderships, cynical, talking about Venezuela, about oil, talking about Ukraine, about rare earths, without any conscience of the historical drama for the people. And we are in a point where governments and people seems to be two different stories, completely divided. And that's where I believe we are in a moment where new forces are going to enter in history. And this is true even in Europe. Because each time the European Council, each time the Commission sees any subject, it's always too late and too little. Inability to really take in their hands history and face history. And more than that, not only insufficient capacity to act, but also playing with time and playing with division. When we are facing today the pressure of the Trump administration, most of the Europeans are calculating how less they can lose, how much they can win, while they know collectively we are all losing. So there is this different level of awareness, this different level of capacity to act, but most of the people are feeling that we are losing, that tomorrow won't be a good day for us. Tomorrow won't be for our children what it has been for us. So this dialectic between progress and catastrophe is completely changing the mindset of the world.
I would completely agree with you, but let me rephrase this dialectic in a slightly different way. One of the dangers you pointed out just before is that of liberal democracy suddenly morphing into something not liberal anymore. But isn't where the problem is in the first place? Our liberal democracies, for the last 30 years or so, maybe out of overconfidence, have really seen themselves as the last word, the end of history. We won, this is it. There's nothing else. In the words of Fukuyama, and I'm quoting from memory here, the end of history is when, I quote, we can't imagine a future that's different from the present and better, end of quote. So essentially, it's a mindset. It's not about there's nothing happening in the world. He's very clear about this. It's a mindset. And that mindset is that there's nothing after tomorrow. There's no hope, essentially. It's a very dystopian situation. It's probably not sustainable to live at the end of history. But that at the same time, what liberal democracy has become. And so that's a very circular crisis. So I agree with your diagnosis, but then clearly, and your book is very clear, I think that's one of the virtues of the book, is there's no way back. You're very clear about this. But what would be these new forces coming into politics and opening new horizons?
Well, I think the end of the game, which is happening in front of us, is that because there is no good news, because there is no easy solution, power in our world, political power, needs to invent a new way to keep on with a narrative which is going to maintain the capacity of these powers to keep power in their hand. I think it's very interesting to see how China, how Russia, and how the US are imagining the new moment we are entering in. And it was interesting to see that in the last 2 years, 1 year and a half, we have gone through 3 moments between Europe and the United States. We had the Munich moment, where G. Vance explained to us that we were corrupted, that we were in a moment of on a risk of civilizational erasure. Then we went through the Davos moment, and I think even if it was almost at the same time, the Greenland moment, where there is something of a madness, a total lack of rationality in the way the ambition of the Trump administration was presented. Facing that, you have 3 different responses. The first response is the US response, which is power, more power, and every day the perspective of being more powerful, which is based on the idea of taxing the world system, because I cannot get anything more here, I'm going to take it where it is.
Now you call this logic
pocket.
drill, tax, click.
Exactly.
That's how you describe it.
These are the 3 main tools that the US are using, with the dollar, the extraterritorial legal system, and their ability to, through the digital system, to enter in the mind of everybody, to control the mind. So it's a way to change reality, because they know that there is no good news. When you know that you cannot do anything, the only way is to convince everybody that things are not what they see, that their life is different from what they feel. So changing the narrative, changing reality, changing the truth, which is the daily work of the Trump administration. Then you have the Chinese approach, which is completely different, which is based on one big conviction, one belief, which is the Western world is dying every day. It's collapsing. And because the Western world is dying, in the same way Soviet Union has died, we need to control our society. If we control our society, every single force of our society, we may be able to survive in this dangerous world. And that's why they control the bottom of the system, and at the same time, they want to control the top of the system. And if you want to understand the rationality between cutting the head or the neck of Jack Ma a couple of years ago, and cutting the neck of the number 2 of the defense administration in China, it's the same logic. The same logic that the anti-corruption movement give to the people the feeling that the whole system is fighting for them. So at the end of the day, it's a totally different way to control history. And then you have Russia, which is the old traditional imperialist Tsar system adapted to a post-Soviet era, which is keeping on fighting, keeping on with new wars, and at the end of the day, you achieve what you can achieve, but we all know that one day, the whole system falls apart. So the competition at the end is between China and the US. And it's fascinating is that the only alternative in the world is Europe. A Europe that will believe in itself. In Europe that will be in line with the history of Europe. We are the continent that has learned the more of history, because we have done the worst thing and the best things. So we have experienced. We should be able to navigate in this world. But to start with, we must open our eyes and understand that we need to rethink, reinvent our relationship with the US, to reinvent our relationship with China, and to understand that our first allies today is the rest of the world, the emerging world. This is the real alliance for Europe. But for that, we need to be very clear on our values. What Europe are we talking about? And that's where I think we are, at the end of the day, in front of three visions of Europe who are today invalidated. The first one is the sovereigntist vision of Europe. The idea that each country can have its own sovereignty and get along fine with it. I think that we all know that in a complex world, the whole matter is to play with our dependencies, in trying to limit our dependencies, and at the end of the day, be able to compete, keeping on the global sovereignty of Europe. The second idea, which is, I believe, not suitable and adapted, is the idea of unification of Europe, integrated Europe. Because of this idea, we've been not taking care of the daily life of Europe and not be connected with the reality. And we have not fought for so many realities. Trade, we have not made the battle against the US on trade because we thought we were going to lose, to win more than we were going to lose. And the third idea, which is not adapted, I understand, is the Westernist narrative for Europe. This idea of a Western world that through a military approach, through a moral approach, makes us bigger than any other area around the world. So Europe has to go back to reality. Europe has to go back to a policy of harmonization, of cooperation, of coordination, which is, of course, so difficult. And that's where it's always difficult to put aside a dream and to keep on with reality. We have to put our hands into the mud. And Europe has not been able to do that. To fight every day to make Europe progress in every single sphere. And that is, I believe, the lack of humility of Europe in dealing with the daily life of the Europeans. To achieve results for the European has made people doubt on the future of Europe. So the battle starts with the capacity of the leadership of Europe to make politics again. We have put aside politics. We have to go back to politics. And we have to go back to democracy, to ask people what they want and to deal with it.
But on this issue, two questions which are related. The first one about this second image of Europe, integrated Europe, which you say is ill-adapted. In the book, you are actually very clear that you take some distance from what you call the infatuation with armament, as if arming Europe is a solution to everything. So we have a security and therefore things are fine. And you're very clear that this is not the case. It's arming, fine, but for what? But to have a purpose, you need to have politics, you need to have a policy. You don't say much about the need of perhaps integrated foreign policy. Should it be mutualized? And if so, to what extent? And that would be my first question on this topic.
Well, I think that mutualization as well as coordination, cooperation and consolidation are key words for the future of Europe. But mutualizing Europe, if it has to be every single country accepting the lowest ambition of diplomacy, I don't think it's an answer. And we already know that, let's take Gaza as an example, that most of the Eastern countries won't agree. All the countries under US influence are not going to agree. Germany is not going to agree for sure. And it's better to have Europe having different voices, at least showing that we have the ability to be alive on foreign policy than to all be accepting a minimal foreign policy. So what I think is that we need to accept to integrate reality in our system. The first starting point to integrate reality is to have a European Security Council. I had the experience, I was Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2004 during the first council where we were all together around the table and we all thought the same thing. Okay, we are 27, we have no more than 3 minutes to speak because of course when you are 27 and we don't agree on anything. I was lucky when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs because at the time, if you were speaking strongly, you could have leadership. And on many, many issues, we could decide, because France and Germany, I was minister and Joschka Fischer was minister in Germany, we could prepare first the meetings and have most of the council accepting the proposal. But that needed very strong Franco-German, and of course we know all the reluctances in this regard. So we need a Security Council. That means that 5 countries in Europe, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and Poland, should have a say on the most crucial existential matters, whether it's diplomacy or any other. I don't think we can go forward at the speed we need to go when it is a matter of survival for Europe if we don't take the decision to create such a Security Council. I think that this Security Council needs a roadmap. And I think the roadmap today is a sovereignty pact, a European sovereignty pact on technology, on digital, on financial, on defense, that is going to obligate us, point after point, to take the decision to limit our dependencies on the US, on China, on any region of the world. And this is the roadmap, how to make sure that we are going to survive as independent countries and free countries. And I think what we have accepted during the last years, concerning, for example, the position of Poland for a couple of years, of Hungary today, is not acceptable. We have to find a way to consider that when a country does not share the values of Europe, it cannot stay in the European construction, or at least cannot participate in a full, complete way. But the problem is going to be a very, very delicate issue. If tomorrow France falls as a populist country, after tomorrow Germany, and so on, then the whole Europe will completely change. And then, of course, the whole history of the European Union will be a disaster. So, pushing forward very strongly, we need decision. The current institution, the current practice of the institution is not acceptable.
How worried are you? Because, about the future of Europe, because I'm listening to you and it just comes to my mind that, yes, that would be a way forward, but at the same time, the diagnosis you give us in this book is very gloomy. I can think also in the conversation at large, there's, a friend of mine organized a conference in New York called Europe After the EU. There's been a recent book published by a Chinese philosopher raised in Japan called Post-Europe. It's in the air already. There's a sense of impending doom. How anxious are you about the future of Europe?
I'm of course very anxious, but I think that if you open your eyes on the world, we are not the only ones who should be anxious. When you look at the US today, it's a mess. The US are going through a civil war, a cultural civil war, and it's not going to get any better in the next years. And the price for US democracy, the price for the power of the US. You see, what's amazing is that we have the nose on the window, and we don't have the perspective. But what does Donald Trump has achieved in the last months? Venezuela, It's a total failure. No, he has not achieved anything. Ukraine, he has been completely discredited, playing with Vladimir Putin, unable to make history in Ukraine. Gaza, they're still dying every day. So wherever you look, this administration creates the feeling of movement, but not movement. It's not history. History is not being made. They're just messing up with the world.
But isn't that an argument going further into that direction? Because we see in Europe people trying desperately to cozy up and remain in abusive relationship with Trump.
That's where the first thing I'm asking to the European leadership and to the European people is to stick to what they are. You see, we are a continent that went through hell. We went through Holocaust, colonization. We've really went through horrors of history. And the one thing we learned is that we have to stick with our conscience. We don't need to read the newspaper. We don't need to listen to Donald Trump in Davos to know what to do. And that's what strikes me the most. Public opinions, media, intellectuals are floating. And we need leaders that are able to go back to some very simple truths, which is this, what's going on is unacceptable. There is no need to have 5, 6, 7 of our leaders going in the White House to meet with Donald Trump to say what? We should say very bluntly and very clearly in a European Council and very dramatically that we cannot accept this name of the game. The way the world is ruled, the American leadership is not acceptable for us anymore. And the people that still think that if we do that, we will lose the nuclear protection of the US, I don't think they have understood very completely where we stand. You see, that's why someone like General de Gaulle in the 60s has put forward the idea of a full-range defense, because he understood that why should the US risk their own life for the Europeans? Do you really think that this has any credibility?
It's never been the doctrine anyway to engage nuclear war for a war in Europe.
But we see it in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Donald Trump doesn't give a shit about Ukraine. He doesn't give a shit about the Ukrainian people. And the same in the Middle East. This is the absolute truth. And at this moment, we don't need to dream anymore. We need to get out of this nightmare, open our eyes and make decisions. And you see, that's what leadership is made for. And too many people think today that we can be satisfied with speeches, with presentation of their own person. This is not a time for individuals. This is a time for people, for collective defense and collective awareness. And I think that for the Europeans, whenever it's difficult to count on their own leadership, every one of us needs to go back, and that's where universities, schools, every single individual as a conscience need to really be in phase of what we were, what we are, and what do we want to be tomorrow. And this is a commitment we need every day to adjust, to follow our principles. And we are not in line with our principles. We were not in line with our principles in Ukraine. We were not in line on the Middle East. We were not in line in our reaction to Venezuela. And at one point, we need to say no to the US administration very specifically, very loudly, and with a lot of solemnity. And I think this is the start for a new Europe to be built.
So, as a last question before opening up to the audience, what do you see as the role of culture and maybe universities more specifically in that future that you just sketched for us, if any? Because these are also institutions that are being disrupted by AI. The same mechanisms you described about democracy apply and are, as we speak, applying to universities. And they are being gutted by the different countries that fund them in terms of national budgets.
I think this is a key moment for culture and for university. And if I have one regret is that during the last years, there was not enough awareness in Europe about how important is our collective experience of culture. We see a collapse of time. Collapse of time because everything is being mixed. Past, present, future, we don't make the difference. And this uniformity is not allowing us to make decisions. We are exactly in the situation of a young kid, 10 years old kid, scrolling on Instagram and on TikTok, and nothing makes any difference. All these narratives are saying just one thing: I'm addicted to the machine, I'm addicted to technology, but I'm not able to decide by myself. We've seen also a collapse of attention. You see, I remember as a kid spending 6 hours, 8 hours reading. I don't know if you have any experience of kids reading for more than 1 hour today. It's
if that.
At
least mine.
Yeah, of course. It's difficult. We have a collapse of complexity. Always easy solutions, without thinking, without weighting the pros and cons. We see the collapse also of collective decisions. And that's where democracy needs to renew. Of course, voting every 4 or 5 years is one thing, but the ability to have collective decisions through conventions, through debates, through parties that will take their part in education of opinion, this is a necessity. And that's why culture, because of the ability to restore the continuity between the past and the present and the future, because the capacity of universities to weight the price of things, I think they are both sanctuaries, but at the same time workshops, laboratories of this new era we should give birth to. So we are in a very important moment where we need places for culture, we need places for education, much more open than what they are today, and much more protected from any influence of the state and any influence of power. And that's why it's almost a sacred commitment to pledge for the defense of these communities. And the real injustice in the world for me today is the inequality in terms of access, both to culture and to education. And if there is one thing we should fight every day in our countries, is to make sure that we can correct these inequalities. You see, I have seen all my life, all my career, and I was astonished when I was 20 years old, going through exams and schools, universities, and so on. Most of my friends were convinced that if they were achieving good educations, it is because they were more clever than the neighbor. And I never thought that. I always thought that was purely chance and pure ability to be connected with the request of the educational system. We were 4 in my family, 4 kids. One brother died, and then we were 3. And we went, the 3 of us, into the same school in France, l'École nationale d'administration, which is considered as one of the brightest. And I always said that even a mule could enter into this school. You just need the codes. If you had the code, you can go into it. And that's why I always thought that in Europe, the elites were not aware enough of their duty to transmit. We are in a moment, not only we need to fight for the future, but we need to fight to transmit values, experience, memories. Because at one point, I think that a huge part of our legacy might die if we don't do that. So yes, it is an existential, it is a matter of survival for our societies, but also it's a matter of survival that we keep on thinking that if we read books, if we learn things, it's not just to learn, it's to be better person, to be better societies, to keep on bettering collectively the way we will behave, the way we will build the world. So culture is not just for fun. And I think too often we have lost this perspective. We are lucky to be able to study. We are lucky to have books. We are lucky to have a chance to go to school in good schools. But this creates a duty for us towards the rest of our community and the rest of the world.
Thank you. On these words, I will invite the audience to raise up to this challenge by now it's your turn to ask questions. I think there are a couple of microphones in the room, so please raise your hand, say who you are, and if you can be brief, because I'm sure there will be many questions and there's not much time. So I will just open the floor. I think there's someone over there.
Hello, I'm Alexander Aerts. I'm a second-year researcher at the history department, researching on Alexander Kojève. My question was for you regarding the sovereignist discourse you have about Europe, that we need to be strong or we need to find a sense in the world. How could you think to decouple that from, I would say, certain politics that are very, very strong in Europe regarding, for example, borders, regarding Frontex? There's a very clear line. Seems like in the European Union, it's also the biggest agency in terms of financial support. How could you kind of create a Europe that is not, a Europe basically just where more people are welcome in this regard, And yeah, so my question is how to be able to, decouple the, right-wing discourse basically from, and right-wing politics from a stronger Europe?
I think that already we've seen a very strong and damaging decoupling in Europe between the ideals of Europe and the realities. And the inability for Europe to put forward a common policy for asylum and immigration. Of course, we have new text and new legislation coming on. But most of our governments have been unable to have both fair policies, human policies, and effective policy with results. And this is very much damaging the ability for Europe to keep on with its tradition of universalism and humanism. And this, of course, has been seen around the world as a very selfish Europe, fortress Europe. The question is, what is going to be our collective model? When we see that in the US, the anti-immigration movement, anti-immigration policy pushed forward through the ICE an attitude so cruel, so inhuman, that it is showing to us what would be in Europe the consequences if in one big country of Europe you have a right-wing, extreme right-wing movement that was in power. I think we might see exactly what we see today in the US, and this is able to project us to the consequences. And if we understand that in the US, this vision of ICE going into the streets of Minneapolis and some other cities and creating such turmoil, disorder, and injustice is exactly the goal of the administration, to show to the voters that what they voted for is now reality. We understand that it's not only a matter of politics, it's a matter of our ability to see the reality and its consequences, to see the consequences of certain political choices with the eyes of a European. And I believe that the brutality of the US system, as we can see it today, unfortunately is adapted to Europe, just the beginning of a new world where no one of us will be able to really judge the system because we won't have the tools to do so. TV, medias, radios, social networks will give us a vision of what is going on in terms of immigration policy, which will be so distorted that what we believe today might not be even seen tomorrow in our democratic system. So what I really feel is that the whole reality of democracies is turning. The whole democratic system is being turned by the idea of law and order, by the idea of necessity, by the idea of defending yourself. And I understand that in the US, and it might come up in Europe, there is the feeling of making sure that we take decision now concerning our societies in order not to be replaced, because that is one of the big fear in our societies, not to be replaced, not to be outsmarted by a new population. If you take into account that in the 40s, in 2040, 2050, the population of the US should be dominated by Latinos and not anymore by white people, you understand that this fear of being replaced is very strong, as it is strong in some Eastern European countries and very strong in some of our countries, like in France today. So we have to find ways to show that through politics, we can find tools, we can find answers, which is going to enable us to respond to the necessity of a mastered immigration, not unlimited, not uncontrolled immigration. And I think the credibility of democracies is being tested today on how they can, on a short-term basis, completely switch and respond to the fear and to the anger of their population. So that is, I would say, the other part, the other duty of democracies is to take seriously the fear and the anger that is mounting into their own population and reversing our democratic system.
There was a hand over there in the back. You. Yep.
William Drosiak, a senior visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. I'd like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on what should be Europe's role in a new age of great power rivalry? You mentioned that the need for Europe to reach out to the global south, develop new relationships. We've just seen the EU and India sign a trade accord, Mercosur and the EU as well. But do you think this can be pushed further into another realm, let's say security and even changing institutions such as the United Nations? How can Europe assert power in this new age and defend its own interests against these other powers?
I think it's a very important question. Trying to build up alternatives. We see that many of the current new empires are not willing to cope with multilateralism, for example, and we need to make sure that this keeps alive on many sectors, environmental issues, peace and war. We need to find common agreements. We need to support public goods. So there is a challenge for us to put on the side, whether it's temporarily or for a longer period, the countries that are not going to play the game. And I think it's not a fantasy to just imagine, for example, whether we should have the UN based not anymore in New York, but based in Geneva, for example. We have already an important representation of the UN in Geneva. But whenever the US is not respecting the Charter, for example, during the June meeting on the Palestinian issue, the US administration did not agree to have the Palestinian leadership coming to New York. I think this is not acceptable. And we see that more and more the situation of the UN in terms of finances, for example, is being more and more critical. So each time we see a difficulty, we should find and fight for an alternative. In the case of Europe, I think the emerging countries is, of course, one of the clue. The Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has said in Davos that why not a leadership of the middle-sized country? I think that's also a possibility. I think we have many different types of alternatives. Having Europe dealing more with the BRICS Plus, for example, with the Shanghai Organization. Of course, these organizations are not satisfactory completely in terms of human rights, in terms of their behavior on many important world issues. But we need to find a way to diversify the monitoring of the world and the way to cooperate on global issues. One of the interesting things for Europe would be to reanalyze what should be the main geographical sectors they should privilege. As a Frenchman, but there are many other nations who care very much about Africa. I'm, of course, very concerned about the future of Europe and Africa. Africa will be in 2050 more than 2 billion people. In 2100, it will be more than 4 billion people. And of course, it's going to be one of the important poles of the future of the world. We are not doing enough. We are not looking enough at African realities, whether it's Maghreb or the whole of Africa. The same for Middle East. Middle East is the one region in the world which has the less regional cooperation. We have gone through a long way in terms of experience in regional cooperation, the Europeans, and we should do much more to facilitate the ability to the Middle Eastern countries to work more together in order to share resources. We see that one of the source of difficulties today for the Iranian economy is water, for example. The whole Middle East has a problem of water. We have been sharing coal and steel for many years. And today we could help the Middle East to share water, to share resources, in order to have a different perspective than just conflict and failed states. So the ability for Europe to inject, to inoculate new ideas, new projects around the world is absolutely key. I'm amazed when I look back to the last 15 years to see how little international projects have been coming from within Europe. You see, just China, and of course we can be critical about the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road Initiative. But at one point it has responded to many of the expectations of some key regions like South America or Central Asia. And we have not been able to have such a huge world project. Global Gateway, it's almost an empty vision of our relationship with the world. So we lack perspective, we lack projects, and that's why we cannot project ourselves on the coming years. We need to reinvent our relationship with the world if we want to really be at the level of our historical mission. But this needs to start by reshaping our organization, by refueling the capacity of Europe to act and to decide, and not just be this too often bureaucratic machine which seems to be too decoupled from the realities of Europe and the realities of the people of Europe.
I think there are many other questions, but I'm afraid because...
Maybe one last.
We should take one last, and because I know you have a heavy schedule straight after this event, so please, and this will be the last question.
Thank you. I'm Calypso Nicolaidis. I'm professor of global affairs at the Florence School of Transnational Governance, which is downtown, and where I hope we can welcome you to at some point. And I wanted to just simply note that you brilliantly spoke against the use of force in international relations, unsurprisingly for the man who said the most eloquent no in recent decades. But I want to ask you, under what conditions do you think that the use of force is appropriate and legitimate? When you mentioned Ukraine, and vis-à-vis a Russia that doesn't listen and wants to take the whole of Donbass, you mentioned Gaza. What should you have done if you were in charge on October 8th? And you mentioned Iran, which is the most agonizing, of course, scene in today, and you so rightly bemoaned the tragedy there. And we all agree that democracy has to come from within. But even from Iranians who have so long said, we will do it, today we hear, come in, intervene, we are in pure despair, your own word. So under what condition do we use force? And let me ask one footnote question. Do you believe in the ideal of a feminist foreign policy?
Well, on the question of the use of force, my belief and my experience is that there is no shortcuts. And whenever you have an open crisis, a tragedy, it's often too late to take the good measures and to put forward the good answers. Just to analyze the situation of Iran, because I think it's a good geopolitical example. We were not without capacities during the last years to make sure that what is happening would not happen. In 2003, people have forgotten, but after the Iraqi drama, after the US intervention, when we had to face the fact that the US were not willing to use collective security as a tool to address the situation of Iraq, while every report we were having from the international community was, it is working. If we remember that what was on the table at the time in Iraq was the ability for the international community to monitor the question of non-proliferation. And the US have destroyed the tool that we were putting in place at the time. The UN, with the inspectors, were creating a system that could have been reproduced in North Korea, for example. Now it's, of course, too late. In Iran. And that's exactly what happened. And I took the decision before the summer of 2003, so just after the military intervention, with my German colleague and my British colleague to go to Tehran and to start the first round of negotiation on the nuclear program of Iran. And we signed at the time the first agreement, just through diplomacy, because we were aware that if the US had decided to strike in Iraq, they could have the bad idea to strike in Iran a couple of months after. So preemptive diplomacy does exist, and it's much safer than preemptive use of force. The same happened in 2015. The world community signed an agreement with Iran. If the Trump administration would have comply with this treaty and not reverse the decision in 2018, of course, the situation of Iran wouldn't be the same. So diplomacy has many capacities. Diplomacy is not without power when it is well used in due time and with a vision. And of course, when the situation is an open wound, like we see it today. And of course, as well as in Venezuela, we have to take into account that the situation has been degraded so much in this region, also because of sanctions, creating an incredible disaster. If you add the hydric shortcuts, if you add sanctions and so on, you see the reality of Iran, and on the top, of course, the cruelty of the mullah's regime. So facing such a situation, facing the situation of Gaza, if the use of force cannot be satisfactory without paying a huge price and with the support of the international community, because of course the use of force can be accepted when it has the legitimacy of the UN, when it has the ability to satisfy to some criteria like self-defense. Under these reasons, these criteria, then the use of force can legitimate. But each time we've been facing this situation, Libya is a very good example, because we had a resolution in 2011 with the resolution 1973, but of course France and the UK and most of the Western countries, they decided not to comply by the resolution and to go deeper into the use of force, which has created a rift between Russia and our countries. So when you have an open wound, you have, to my sense, two possibilities. To put pressure on the international community in order to create the possibility of a responsibility to protect, either through the Security Council or through a vast majority of the General Assembly. The General Assembly could decide, even if it doesn't have the legal capacity as such, but creating a moral background, a moral legitimacy for a humanitarian action. You could have dreamed about a humanitarian intervention in Gaza. The the 27 countries putting together some humanitarian force and deciding to go in the vicinity of Gaza and to take over their responsibility, for example, in sending care and food for the people of Gaza. Of course, we all know that this would not have been easy. And then we were going to be confronted in a situation with the Israeli forces, with the Israeli government, and then, of course, the attitude of the US, the attitude of China would have been key. But I think that facing such open crisis, we should push as much as we can to confront governments with their own responsibility. I'm not sure that confronted with such a responsibility on a humanitarian ground, the legitimacy of the Israeli government would have been strong enough to take the risk not to do at least some gesture. There is one thing which I feel unacceptable today. How can the world accept that we have no independent information, no independent access to the Gaza territory today, up today? Open Gaza should be, for any democracy, a clear demand. How can all the free press of the world accept the idea not to be able by themselves to say what is going on in this place? This, take 20 years from now, will be an absolute scandal. How can democracies accept not to know what's going on in this place and to let things as they are, when we know that very easily we could alleviate the suffering of kids, women, people without any capacity in this territory? Why keeping on letting these people suffer the way they suffer without not doing anything? So that's where I think the commitment of states, we could go further. But I think there's one very interesting question. Starting with the genocide in Rwanda, 1994. And then, of course, the genocide in former Yugoslavia, in Srebrenica. How come we have not been able, through think tanks, diplomacies, universities, to go much further, much deeper into the question, well, if the UN is paralyzed, if there is no other way, what will be the option besides the use of military force? And I think that that's where we still have to put on the table something new. Responsibility to protect is blocked by the UN Security Council. Not to do anything, I think, is creating in the heart of the world community such a deep trauma that we will have to live with it and try to find new answers in the coming years. And that's where today, yes, we can say that collective diplomacy is without power, without effectiveness, and we need, in an urgent basis, to be able to address this question. But the first step is to confront powers with their responsibility. I think, for example, in the case of Iran, China is buying the Iran oil. Russia is buying the Iranian weapons. Confronting these countries with their responsibility, human responsibility, is, I think, the first step. From that, the pressure on the Iranian regime, the pressure on the neighbors. Because, of course, creating a logistic humanitarian assistance, it's always easier through neighbors, through community approach. I think this is, and this is for me the real scandal, these are questions that are not even raised. I don't know one single country in Europe or outside Europe that has been able to raise the question, should we not invent a humanitarian intervention? Humanitarian, again, not force, humanitarian intervention with the help of countries close to the Israeli regime in Gaza, close to the Iranian regime in Iran, in order to create, or try at least to create, the basis of action to support these countries. So I think step by step we might approach and be connected with the realities of the suffering. But of course, we are facing an ideological situation where the question is not raised, the consequences are not being assumed by anybody in the international community, but the trauma is already there. And I believe for every single country in Europe, every single country in the region, in the Middle East, this would be a very heavy burden. And that's maybe one of the most urgent problem we should address, one of the biggest urgency of our world.
Thank you very much. I think
you.
these are not necessarily the most uplifting words, but there's a glimmer of hope, and we'll cling on to that. I'm sure there's many other questions, and the conversations can proceed at the receptions outside, but please join me in thanking very much Dominique de Villepin for his time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Un peu en retard sur votre programme, mais
C'est pas fait pour ça.
il va passer, non?
Bien.